Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by PYA. Today, we're continuing our timely, tough, or tricky physician compensation and fair market value topic series with a presentation on It's Anything But Vanilla, Managing Physician Compensation Risk and Management Services. PYA is happy to present today's webinar on this important topic. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing a message into the questions pane of the control panel. We'll collect these and address them via email after the webinar, and all our webinars are recorded and released with a copy of the slides after the event. With that, I would like to introduce PYA Principal Lyle Ulrich and Senior Manager Derek Long. Both Lyle and Derek consult with physicians' practices, hospitals, and healthcare systems in the areas of physician compensation planning, fair market value compensation, and commercial reasonableness. Lyle and Derek have many years of experience in these areas, as well as in advising clients on other strategic, financial, and operational issues, including management services agreements and physician compensation risk assessments.
Thank you, Jennifer. Welcome to each of you all here today. We're very excited to bring you another webinar in our series on physician compensation and fair market value and some of the timeliest, toughest, and trickiest topics. We're grateful to have you join us here today. And if for some reason this may be your first webinar, please know that we're doing this as a part of a series, and we've got over 2 seasons prior to this available to you. If you're dealing with a particular fair market value topic of interest, feel free to check out that particular link, and I'll ask the moderator just to kind of chat that in real quickly. And of course, these webinars as well continue to be sourced by our experience in these matters and your feedback. So if for some reason you don't see an item out there as a part of the Triple T webinar series and you're dealing with it, we'd love to hear your thoughts and have an opportunity to perhaps talk about it in the near future as well. But moving forward into the discussion today, and if you didn't know, July 23rd, actually one of my favorite days of the year. I like sweets in particular, but it's National Vanilla Ice Cream Day. And so to celebrate, we thought we'd talk about some items really that are anything but vanilla, so you can complement that vanilla ice cream. And by that, in the physician compensation and fair market value world, we're going to focus on some tips and best practices to help you assess physician compensation risk within your organization. And I'll start there, and then I'm going to pass the baton to Derek, who's going to be talking about some of the common management service agreement structures and how they're typically valued. So as we get started here today on this first slide, it's a very busy slide, and very much so for a purpose, and that is we all have a lot to think about when it comes to physician compensation risk. And of course, I might just start with just talking generally about what is risk, because risk is relative, right? Sometimes I'll draw on a dictionary definition, and if you look up risk, it'll mention something like exposure to danger, harm, or loss. And I don't know necessarily at all times we're dealing with that specifically, although perhaps in some instances we are when we think about physician compensation risk. But how you measure physician compensation risk is very important too. And so you'll see things on here that relate to the regulations that help us assess risk. So we're talking about START, the anti-kickback, false claims, and many others to that matter. You'll see the big 3 on here: fair market value, commercial reasonableness, and the volume or value standard. And then going back to relativity, the physician compensation benchmark survey. So you might be familiar with MGMA, and they all create some sort of range of compensation, maybe from the 10th to the 90th percentile or by quartiles, et cetera, all helping you determine what type of risk you may have and how it is relative. And all of these are really, really important. And I'll just give you a quick example related to commercial reasonableness. You may or may not be aware of this, but several well-known valuation firms don't do commercial reasonableness. And they don't do it because there's a lot of risk to doing a commercial reasonableness assessment. Again, it's a separate and distinct concept from fair market value. So they're two different items, and commercial reasonableness is a lot more broader in context than just the dollars and cents. And I often use the expression of, does the transaction make sense? And the CENTS refers to fair market value, and then SENSE refers to commercial reasonableness, where yes, you do consider the dollars that are transacted between two particular parties, but you're looking more in depth at the business purpose, some of the providers, the facilities, the contract oversight process, and many other factors. So it can be very complex to do it. And again, because it's complex, that carries risks with it as well. There's so many important items on this slide. I won't get a chance to talk about all of them here today in our brief 30 minutes together, but rock star physicians, extenuating circumstances. If you're not familiar with that, or the guidance, or perhaps the commentary made by CMS, there is commentary out there about those, and I imagine you often find yourself having extenuating circumstances and perhaps dealing with those rock star physicians. So you might want to take some time, if you're not familiar with that commentary, to familiarize with it yourself. But really, what I wanted to focus on here today is measuring physician compensation risk and a framework for it. And so I'd like to start here on this slide, and again, allow me to orient you a little bit to this particular slide because there's a lot on here. But we're gonna pick on employed physician arrangements because obviously they're a very common type of an arrangement in the industry. And I'm going to start with the cone. Of course, it's an ice cream cone. If it wasn't today, you might hear me refer to that as perhaps a funnel. And what we're going to do to help measure the risk of these employed physician arrangements is we're going to put all of our employed physicians in at the top of the funnel. And then we're going to be looking at particular metrics that they are dealing with here to help assess the risk. So for example, you would need, in this particular case, the physician's FTE status, their compensation, their work RVUs, and their professional collections. And then you need some physician benchmark compensation surveys, again, to make some comparisons to the actual data that's on here. Then notice as well that we've created sort of 3 tiers of perhaps tests that we're going to run to help assess the risk of these particular arrangements. And the ones that are on here are, for example, purposes only. I think each organization, because you are in a unique environment, really needs to set their own level of risk tolerance. And again, as you sit here and contemplate these, I think there's some guidance that you may benefit from setting a lower threshold, perhaps below the median. For those of you all who aren't familiar with the complaint that was filed by the government against Citizens Memorial, in that particular case, the cardiologists were being paid less than median compensation, and that was deemed to be outside of fair market value for some economic factors that we won't have time to get into today. But again, even at the median, it may not be okay from a fair market value and a commercial reasonableness perspective. And then also on the flip side, as you look at tier 3 here, and I'm going to delve into these just a little bit further in a moment, we even have guidance from CMS, and I think it goes along the lines of saying it's incorrect that compensation that's at or below the 75th percentile is always appropriate, and then likewise compensation that's above the 75th is always presumed inappropriate. So you really need to think about some tiers that might fit for your organization, but for demonstration purposes today, I pulled these 3 tiers here today, and you'll be able to look at these again, really the 50th, the 60th, and then the 75th percentile. And we're going to be looking at things, if we run this analysis, is physician compensation or the comp per work RVU or comp to professional collections at or below the median. And then that's going to give us one level of risk. And then as we move to the second level, perhaps looking at compensation that's at or below the 60th percentile, but maybe there's some extenuating circumstances, such as a physician's years of experience or a specialty that is in high community need demand. And then, of course, the 75th percentile, again, those would be arrangements that were above the 75th in total comp, perhaps 75th comp per work RVU and 75th comp to professional collections. Again, just all ways to help stratify risk as it relates to physician compensation arrangements. And then depending on how the particular arrangements fall out, you could either pull together a scatter plot. We've seen organizations do that so that they can really focus on the ones that they consider to carry the greatest risk. And you might end up looking at the lower level of tiers, just a few of those to make sure you're still comfortable with them. But then that third tier in particular, you might end up delving into all of those particular arrangements to make sure that they get further analyzed. Keep in mind too, again, I told you that we were picking on the employed arrangements. You can do something very similar for the other types of compensation, administrative, maybe it's a medical director, call coverage, academic, and other forms of compensation as well. But real quickly here, as I begin to wrap up my comments and before I transition it to Derek, I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes talking about some tips and best practices for managing physician compensation risk. And I'm not going to go through all of these, although I'd love to get the time to do so, but we promised to be brief and to the point here today. But let me hit just a few of these. First, as simple as it sounds, be consistent. And again, it might seem so elementary, but what you need to be thinking about when you have these arrangements in your organizations is having and treating a physician differently can actually be a bad thing. And really, if you end up being inconsistent, the question will quickly be asked, why are you treating this physician, maybe this specialty, this circumstance, why are you treating this differently? And in the absence of a really definitive answer, if the transaction ever gets looked at, it could be determined, or at least you may be accused of treating this physician or circumstances differently because you're considering the volume or value of referrals. And that's certainly not the intent and the direction that anybody, I believe, really is trying to go. Second, I wanted to mention is the annual review. Again, sounds so elementary. It doesn't have to be very time intensive, but I really would encourage everybody to try to touch these arrangements on an annual basis. The bottom line is nothing ever goes exactly according to plan. We can all have the best intentions. We may think a physician's productivity is going to be X. We may think they might incur Y hours in medical director duties, but ultimately at the end of the day, it usually doesn't happen exactly as planned. And so just touching these in some way is important. I want to touch on governmental complaints too, because there's such good information, and perhaps I would even add the advisory opinions as well. There's such good information in these sources. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples. Many of the governmental complaints have made sure to point out that it's a best practice to separate the person responsible for making physician compensation decisions from physician referral data. Now, sometimes that's not always allowed if it's a very small organization, but having access to that information and being responsible for making the physician compensation decisions is generally frowned upon. And we can get into details at another point in time if anybody wants to. Unusual provisions, just pick on maybe Toomey for just a moment. We were paying full-time benefits for part-time physicians. And again, you would expect part-time physicians to get part-time benefits, but that's an unusual provision. And so just leave with that concept. Do you have or carry any unusual provisions in your arrangements? And then finally, I want to talk about benchmarking. This literally is the #1 common error, if you'll let me use that expression, where we're not using data in an apples to apples fashion that matches the definitions that are actually in the surveys. I had a client just 2 weeks ago present some data to us, and they had included some benefits as compensation, and they hadn't separated it out. Some of the physicians were trying to understand why their compensation was lower than what they thought it would be. So it's a very common instance. Work RVUs, they should generally be personally performed, which is the way that the surveys are actually describing them. And so you'll want to make sure that they truly are. And when physicians work, by way of example, with APPs collaboratively, that can get a little bit difficult to ascertain the difference between the two. So that's really important too. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with perhaps another nugget here, but really consider using a contract checklist. And if you don't have one, I'm going to share one. I'm going to ask the moderator to chat in another link to a physician contract checklist. It's on our website, but it really helps start the process of making sure that you're consistent, the reviews are happening appropriately, and you're identifying what's important to your particular organization. So with that, I'm going to pause and I'm going to transition it to Derek to talk about management agreements.
All right, thank you, Lyle. So this is a topic that I think I could talk about for an hour or two, but I'm really going to try to keep this really high level, as Lyle mentioned, and hit our remaining 15 or so minute time frame. However, if you do want to get a little bit more granular, please feel free to submit a question, as we mentioned earlier, and we'll be glad to follow up with you on that after the webinar. So a quick background on management services agreements, or MSAs, as I will refer to throughout this section. They've been in existence in healthcare for decades and historically focused on administrative or operational tasks. MSOs, management services organizations, provide hospitals, ambulatory surgery centers, physician practices, you name it, with various operational and functional services. These non-clinical services, which are also known as purchase services to some, are geared towards strengthening business aspects of an operation through expertise, cost efficiencies, economies of scale in business services. Some examples that are typical to include are billing services, day-to-day oversight and administration, or managed care contracting, although there are many, many more that I won't list out here today. A little firsthand observation here, but MSA valuation work has skyrocketed up our list in terms of projects that we're asked by our clients to work on within our compensation valuation service line here at PYA. They've just grown exponentially within the past 3 years or so, at least in my opinion and my experience. And while they're becoming more popular with organizations, I think a lot of that increased volume that we're seeing for us is because these types of arrangements have come under a lot of scrutiny lately, which makes this topic both timely and tricky to keep with our theme here. So several laws and regulations apply to management services agreements. Those are including, but certainly not limited to, the False Claims Act, Federal Anti-Kickback Statute, the Stark Law, IRS private inurement regulations, which affect tax-exempt organizations, state anti-kickback and self-referral laws, and then state corporate practice of medicine laws. A couple of examples of enforcement actions related to management services in fiscal year 23 alone include allegations of specialists allocating non-fair market value payments to referring physicians in the context of co-management agreements, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and labs paying physicians through MSOs to induce referrals for specimen collection services that are above fair market value. So as you can see with just those two examples, MSAs cover all types of entities and services in healthcare, and the government is paying close attention to them. Here we go. So given our healthcare focused audience here today, I would be remiss if I did not touch on co-management arrangements, since they fall under the same umbrella as pure management arrangements. But co-management agreements and management agreements serve distinct purposes and involve different entities and have kind of different responsibilities. So a co-management agreement is a collaborative agreement with goals of improving quality and efficiency of a specific hospital, department, or service line. And this involves the hospital and the physician group sharing responsibility for managing those services, i.e. co-managing, with joint decision-making and shared governance. The physicians play a really significant role in both clinical and administrative aspects, and a portion of compensation is typically held at risk in these arrangements, and those are based, the at-risk component is based on the achievement of predetermined performance, quality, efficiency targets, things like that. This is in contrast to the hierarchical arrangement of a management services arrangement, where the manager has control over the day-to-day operations, and the managed organization retains, ownership, but delegates those operational tasks. So the types of compensation under management arrangements and co-management arrangements were briefly mentioned on that previous slide, but I did want to go into a little bit more detail here on those. So here you can see the various structures for both management and co-management arrangements and when they're typically deployed. And I should mention, for purposes of this slide, traditional is referring more so to management services, while the modern section is referring more so to the co-management services. Wholesale management services are usually structured, and I stress usually because it's definitely not always the case, but they're usually structured on a fixed fee basis based on the estimated cost to provide the services, plus an appropriate profit factor, which we're going to cover in a little more detail on the next slide. There are other types of arrangements that are limited to certain services, such as billing, and those types of arrangements are often structured where the compensation is based on a percent of revenue collected. And then there are also arrangements where maybe support staff are simply being leased out, and the manager or the lessor is paid such that the employee's fully loaded costs are covered and then marked up an appropriate percentage as a profit factor. In contrast, co-management services usually are structured where a fixed fee is paid based on estimated time required of the physicians providing the services, plus that at-risk component in addition to the fixed fee that's based on the physician group's performance against the predetermined quality metrics. Ideally, the quality metrics on which that incentive compensation is based are developed to enhance the organization's delivery of services and the quality of services to its patients. But one key provision that I really want to note here is that even if that fixed fee is developed and based on an estimate of physician time required to provide the defined services, it is very important to ensure that the physician time spent on those services is actually documented, because you don't want to get in a situation where you're at the end of a contract year, you've wound up paying all this money, for the services that you've received, and you can't prove that those services have really been provided or rendered by the physician. So, if you're in a co-management type arrangement and part of it is fixed, it is critical to ensure that those services are documented by the physicians that are providing those services. So when we actually get to valuing management services arrangements, we typically take two approaches, and it's really a buy versus build situation. So what would it cost you to build these services yourself, which is the cost approach, also known as the cost approach, and how much would it cost to purchase these services from someone else, which is the market approach. The cost approach is generally the primary approach, and we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. Although, as I mentioned on the previous slide, there are instances in which the market approach can be a primary approach, like if you have an arrangement for billing services. So under the cost approach, as you can see in this slide, we're identifying the costs that the manager will incur to provide the defined set of management services. We start with the direct costs, and these include the compensation, benefits, and any other direct staff expenses that can be identified. The buildup for these direct costs is based on the required hours or maybe an FTE allocation of each position. For example, you might have a particular arrangement where a part-time human resources manager is required to provide the required and defined services. So in this case, we might allocate half of an FTE. There might be some arrangements where multiple FTEs might be required of a certain position to provide the services, but it's important to ensure that those costs that are utilized are reasonable. For example, you wouldn't want to include, or we wouldn't include, costs for a human resources manager that's based on an annual salary of, let's say, $300,000. That's pretty obviously in excess of what market rates are for a human resources manager. So we always want to ensure that the costs that are used in the cost buildup are reasonable and reflective of market rates for whatever position and resources are allocated to the management services agreement. It is critical to have discussions and all parties to the management services agreement be in agreement as to what resources are appropriate to be able to deliver whatever management services are defined in your agreement. So in addition to the direct cost, it is also important to include provisions for indirect costs that are going to be incurred by the manager. These are costs such as, there's a lot of them, but payroll processing, human resources support, benefits administration, that type of cost is what we're talking about here, that aren't direct to the resources, but they are certainly costs that are incurred by the manager. And they should be included in the cost buildup because they're part of what makes the manager able to render the services. Once the direct and the indirect costs are quantified, we determine an appropriate markup for profit that a provider of the services would be entitled to. And to make this determination, we review relevant public company data and various industry reports to help establish a baseline markup for profit. And then we assess the risk incurred by the manager to provide the services to adjust that baseline if needed. Some risk factors that might adjust the baseline could include things like the length of the contract, where the longer the term of the contract, the less risk to the provider of the services, and vice versa. The right to terminate the agreement, where if it's very limited, that's less risk to the provider and vice versa. A fixed versus variable fee structure, where if it's variable, which means if the fees are based on the actual resources provided, that's less risk, where if it's a fixed fee, that would typically be considered more risk to the provider. And then market competition is another example. Again, if the level of competition in a particular market is low, probably less risk to the provider of the services, whereas if the level of market competition is really high, if there's an abundant availability of options for the customer to go out and get management services, then again, that's a little bit of a higher risk to the provider of the services. So once we feel comfortable with our markup for profit that we've selected, we apply that to the total direct and indirect cost to get an appropriate compensation rate for management services. Real quick, just shifting gears, I know we're running low on time and this won't take long, but when we apply the market approach, it's important to ensure, and this term's used a lot in healthcare, I know, but it's important to ensure we get an apples to apples comparison by identifying market comparable data with similar components as the subject arrangement. So billing services, as I mentioned, is a good example where we can typically make this apples to apples comparison because those types of arrangements, if they're isolated to just billing services, they don't vary much at all from other billing services arrangements. And while there are resources out there that report market rates for management services as a whole, oftentimes it's really kind of impossible to tell what management services are included in the underlying data that produce those reported market rates. And this makes it, like I mentioned, all but impossible to ensure that you have an apples to apples comparison to your subject arrangement. So the market approach is it's a good test maybe for reasonableness of the results of our cost approach for kind of wholesale management services arrangements, but it's more often than not just not a primary methodology for valuing those types of arrangements, more so for the arrangements that are only for billing services. So with that, I think we're pretty much at our time limit. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and I'll kick it back over to Jennifer to close us out.
All right, thanks to our presenters, Lyle and Derek. If you have any questions, their presentation and contact information will be emailed to you along with a recording of today's webinar. Also, if PYA can provide any assistance with audit, tax, compliance, valuation, or physician services, please call or email us. You may also visit our website at pyapc.com for more details about our specific areas of expertise, or to just subscribe to receive PYA insights. On behalf of PYA, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.